Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.
I wasn't sure. They didn't want to.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do the fasciculi, they have the same names as in the medulla, right?
Fasciculus means a bundle of fibers. That's it.
Right. There's nuclei.
There's a nuclear. You're talking about the gracilis? Yes, that's where this track will end. We'll see it.
And they cross over there.
And they sort of cross over there. We'll talk about this. Yeah.
What divides the motor fibers into pyramidal and extrapyramidal?
Pyramidal means that it comes from the cortex, from the cerebral cortex, and these are our regular voluntary muscles that we move all the time. Okay. The extrapyramidal doesn't come from the cortex. They have their own fasciculi. They go by themselves. They have different function. As I said, mostly it's sort of homeostasis function, keeping us upright, walking, things like that, gait. Okay, that's the difference. Within the pyramidal tract, we have two fasciculi, or two kinds of tract. One is the lateral system, which decussate in the medulla, and the other one is the anterior fasciculus that decussate at the level of the spinal cord. Depends where it's going. Okay. So we discussed this part, the dorsal column, and then we have the anterolateral system, which is you have two parts of it: the lateral spinothalamic and the anterior spinothalamic. It does also move conscious information, sensory information. We'll discuss later what is the difference between what kind of sensory information. But by its name, spinothalamic, it also go up into the thalamus, okay, synapse there, and then goes to the sensory area, to the postcentral. Most of it, not all of it. And then again, we have other sensory information that is not necessarily conscious. The biggest one, of course, is the spinocerebellum. Which also, the spinocerebellar tract, there's a few kinds of cerebellar sensations. Most of them has to do with our location in space. Well, that's not completely true. With things like tension in the muscles, agonist versus antagonist muscles. And these are subdivided into a posterior and anterior tracts, or ventral or dorsal. We discussed this when we talked about the cerebellum, the ventral and the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Okay, and there's a few other smaller ones like the spinal auditory, but that's not important. Important is that the entire this entire structure is throughout the spinal cord. Okay, it remains constant throughout the spinal cord. So it's very easy to localize a lesion to a certain area. It's sort of easy to know what effect will it have. Okay, moving on. We're talking about reflexes. There's a few kinds of reflexes, but I don't know if you learned about reflexes yet. You're going to learn about it because it's very basic clinical. Aside from the reflex itself, it has another clinical significance. I'm not going to go through all reflexes, but just the general idea. The quickest and easiest to understand reflex is the one we see over here. I think it's also in the next slide. It's sort of on this next slide, which is basically it's a reflex arc. Okay, it's very easy to understand. We discussed there's special receptors for quick pain. And this will immediately, this is connected to a motor neuron, or an interneuron that connects to the motor neuron, that makes a muscle contract. So if you touch something hot, if something stings you, or you I don't know, a nail or something, your hand will immediately move even before you feel the pain. Okay? That interneuron will eventually, it's not exactly like this, but it doesn't really matter. Eventually, of course, the pain sensation goes up into the brain, but only after you move your hand, actually. So it involves just 3 neurons. The sensory, an interneuron, and the motor neuron. There is even a simpler mechanism, but has nothing to do with pain. It's called a monosynaptic reflex. And this is the knee jerk that we all know. And this has to do with a muscle spindle receptor that what happens is when you hit the patellar ligament here, and it's not only the patella, it's the most prominent in patella, but you have it also in other joints, you stretch the muscle, right? As the spindles in the muscle stretch, as spindles in the muscle stretch, to prevent tear of the muscle, the reflex is to contract the muscle itself. So we're sort of tricking the muscle by this reflex. The body thinks, the receptor, that specific receptor thinks we are overstretching the muscle, so the contraction will prevent the tear of the muscle itself. And as I said, it's not the only, we have a lot of reflexes in other joints in the body. There's also in the elbow and other places. But because the quadricep is such a large muscle, it's very common. It's easy, of course, to see. This is a bit, it's like the basic reflex, but it's a bit more complicated. It's also, it's called a flexor reflex. And it's a double reflex. It's both excitatory to flex a muscle and inhibitory to the antagonist muscle. So when you touch something warm, like in this example, the interneuron here will both excite or stimulate the flexor, in this case the biceps, but it will also inhibit any flexion of the triceps. And this, of course, will cause much more powerful flexion. Yeah.
Why wouldn't you also have that with the stretch receptors? Like
it's a good question.
You
That
don't
it's a good question. I don't know. That's the way it works. Why? I mean, you're right in your question, but maybe there is, but it's not written in the book. So I think it's just affecting one muscle. So here it's important because you want to move your hand away as quickly as possible and without interference. In the muscle, it's this muscle that is sort of in trouble. Okay, maybe that's the reason, but actually I don't know. Okay. And finally, this is very important, we have a lot of reflexes. Most of them we are born with. This is a very famous reflex sign. It's called the Babinski reflex. And in adults, so the real name of it is plantar reflex, but it's after Babinski. In babies, when you go over the sole of the foot, With babies, they will stretch their feet, and with adults, we tend to plantar flex, or flex their fingers at least. So it's a normal sign when babies extend sort of their toes. That's a normal sign in babies, because there is no inhibition to this reflex from the cortex, or from the brain to over the spinal cord. And as we grow, a lot of spinal cord function are inhibited by the brain, and you don't see them anymore. But if you have brain injury, then these reflexes will return, or they will enhance or intense. So like for somebody who has brain injury, all the reflexes will be much more intense, all normal reflexes, and some of the childhood reflexes will return. So that's a classic sign for somebody with brain injury, or at least discommunication between the brain and the spinal cord. And it's very important that if there's no disinhibition from the cortex, reflexes will tend to sort of manifest themselves. And this actually happens in our everyday. Every time, at least with males, when we sleep, throughout REM sleep, they have an erection. Okay? It has nothing to do with sexual behavior. It's just the brain goes to sleep, and erection, it's part of the parasympathetic system. It comes from the sacral parasympathetic system. When the brain is not connected to the spinal cord, and this is what happens in REM sleep, because of the reticular formation, there's no disinhibition, but the outcome is, one of the outcomes is an erection. And this is known also from when they used to execute people by hanging. Some people got erections as they died, and again, nothing to do with I don't know, sexual behavior or whatever. It's just as the brain does.
You also go to the bathroom.
I'm sorry?
Is that the same reasoning when you when you?
Yeah. So as the brain dies, there's less.
Your bowels when you die.
Yeah. Exactly the same reason. So this is a very important clinical. Aside from the reflex itself, this is a very important aspect of checking the reflexes. Okay, if they're if they're too tense, it might mean some sort of brain damage. And there are some, on the other side, there are some diseases of the spinal cord itself. Who's this guy? Huh? Tov. And on the other aspect, of course, some diseases of the spinal cord will makes the reflexes less intense than what they should be, and of course, that's also a problem. We are born with something like 40 reflexes, baby reflexes, and most of them by 3 months are inhibited by the cortex, or they disappear altogether. But the appearance and disappearance of reflexes in babies is one of the basic things they want to check to see if the baby develops in the right order and nobody here has kids, right? Well, soon, yeah. I didn't think otherwise, no. So you'll see, for example, that it's very interesting because there's certain things you wouldn't expect from babies will appear when they are born, and then they will disappear. So one of them is called the grasp, for example. When you put your finger in the baby's hand, they will grasp, okay? And they will grasp so hard you can, don't do it, but you can actually lift them, and they will hold in midair, they won't fall, okay? When they have something around their mouth, when you touch them around their mouth, they will move to the direction of the touch, because this is for breastfeeding basically. So they feel the nipple and they will go to the nipple, okay? And these will disappear. They can even walk. You put a baby, you make him, you hold him like on the side, and you put him on a surface, and they will start walking. And of course, they can't walk; they have no ability to walk. But still, they will do it. It's a reflex, and it will go away after a few months. Okay? So again, this is another important aspect of reflexes. They develop in children or babies, and then they will disappear. Okay, so that's it for the spinal cord. But continuing very quickly, we're going to discuss the pathways of the pathways that ascend and descend into the spinal cord, through or from the spinal cord. Okay. So now we're going to see the entire length of the fibers, the motor system and the sensory systems. And just to see the entire path is also important. Where do they synapse? How do they decussate? Where? So it's also important. So mostly we're talking about, when you're talking about the descending pathways, the motor system, the biggest one of course is the pyramidal system. It descends down into the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata. I changed a bit from what you have. I changed a bit the order, but no, you have the same ones, the same slides. Most of the fibers originate in the precentral cortex. Not all of them, but most of them. And as they descend, they do that on the pyramids of the most anterior part of the medulla. And you'll see, you will see this. We have a few spinal cords. You see them. You just see small bulges on the ventral anterior part of the medulla, and then they sort of disappear inwards. But you see them, and as I said, these are most of the fibers tend to decussate at the middle of the medulla. Others will decussate at the spinal cord. There's a very few minor fibers that don't decussate at all. Now, if you look at the entire length of the fibers originating in the precentral cortex, so they descend through the midbrain, through the cerebral peduncles, through cerebri. Okay, if you remember, this is the midbrain. You can see, for example, the red nucleus here. You can see the substantia nigra. This is the descending pathway, and it's just descending pathway, the corticospinal, the pyramidal tract, the beginning sort of the pyramidal tract. On the side of it, it is also descending pathway, but these are corticopontine fibers, okay, from the cortex, wherever in the cortex, to the cerebellum. Now, some of these fibers will end at the brainstem. And then it's not called corticospinal, it's a subpart of the corticospinal. It's called corticonuclear or corticobulbar, it's the same. And these go to cranial nerves. Because this is motor fibers. And of course, we have, for example, masticatory muscles. We have muscles of facial expression, neck muscles. So if you take, for example, let's talk about the sternocleidomastoid, okay? Which is innervated by the accessory nerve. It's a cranial nerve. So we have fibers originating in the cortex, moving down to the, in that case of the accessory, to the medulla oblongata. Somewhere along the way, they cross to the other side. Okay? Let's take this example. I don't think this is the accessory, but it doesn't really matter. And from here, from this nucleus, of course, there's synapse here. And the next axon goes to the muscle. The exception, by the way, is the facial nerve. That the upper part of the facial nerve doesn't decussate, and the lower part of the facial nerve does decussate. So it's a bineuronal circuit. Okay, it's just two neurons, one from the cortex to the spinal cord or spinal cord or brainstem, and the next neuron will go to the muscle. And of course, there's another synapse between the neuron and the muscle, but just two neurons. And again, as it descends, some of the fibers will cross to the middle of the medulla. Most of the fibers cross to the middle of the medulla, and rest of the fiber, almost the rest of the fibers, will decussate. You can see it here. Will decussate to the other side. Sorry, it's not this one. This is wrong, by the way. It should continue on the same side and then decussate to the other side. They do this in the spinal cord level. There is always the question of why decussate to begin with. What is it good for? We don't really know the answer. But there are a few theories. The first, I'm going to mention just two. There's a lot of them, but just two that we can mention. This is the somatic twist model. So the picture above is of obviously an insect, and underneath it's called Amphioxus. It's the most primitive chordate, and we are part of the chordate family. And what I want you to notice is, I don't know if you know this, but in all vertebrates, all chordates, our sort of spinal nerves are all in the back. The spinal cord and brain, everything is on the back. And with insects, it's the other way around. The nerves are ventral, and sort of their GI tract is in the back. So the theory goes that somewhere along the way, this was hundreds of millions of years ago, there was a twist. For some reason. And this was where we split, I don't know how to call it, between insects and the rest of the animal kingdom, and our stomachs or heads, doesn't really matter, twisted 180 degrees. And of course, when you do that between the head and the rest of the body, you're going to have a twist within the axons themselves also. The other model has to do with it's a sort of a mathematical model that was developed, and this shows statistically or mathematically that when you decussate, you are less prone for errors in each fiber where it's supposed to go. I can't even explain why, but it's That's the model. Okay.
You know what that theory is called? The second one?
You just write down Google why deficit, and you'll find like tons of research on you know the basic blueprint of the body of almost all animals is basically the same. Like between us and flies, it's like 40% similarity. So the basic genetic, cellular genetics and another system is the same. It's the same genes. Okay. Just discuss this. Okay. As these fibers will descend down, again, we're returning a bit to the spinal cord. Of course, the inner structure of the spinal cord is known. And this goes also to the agonist-antagonist muscles. So I have the flexor, it doesn't matter which part of the body, but the flexor and the extensors will always be right next to each other. Okay. And as we see in the reflexes, there are interneurons that connect these two muscles, to groups of muscles, so they can interact together. Because usually it's rare that you apply force both to the agonist and antagonist. It does happen, but usually it's one or the other. Just for example, when you lift something heavy, okay, when I do this, and I lift something heavy, both my back and my abdominal muscles are contracted. I don't know if we should go into this. There's some other kinds of motor neurons that we must think of, that although they're considered motor neurons, they don't directly go into muscles and contracting the muscles. Did you learn about muscle spindles and Golgi tendon? So this has to do with proprioception of how much the muscle is contracted. Okay? We have special receptors within the muscles, within tendons, that can sense how much the muscle is stretched or relaxed. So you know how much more force you need to apply or relax that force. And these are also done by motor neurons, because if you take, for example, a muscle spindle, I'm not going to go into the histological, the way it is built, but as the muscle relaxes, the spindle also relaxes, and it would not work as well. As it relaxes, the ability of the muscle or the receptor to understand how much stretch is within the muscle will tend to lose, because eventually it's like a wire. When you release the tension on the wire, eventually it will fall down. And you can't really tell the tension within that wire anymore. So actually, what happens is the other way around. As the muscle relaxes, the spindle will contract. It will contract to keep the tension, so the body will know how much, how much stretch is within the muscle. So there's a spindle here, like a wire, or like a kfitz. How do you call it? Coil. Yeah, exactly. That actually, as the muscle relaxes, it will contract to keep the tension on the spindle so you can still know how much force is, or how what is the condition of the muscle. So this recoil is a movement, and it's a motor neuron, but it doesn't contract the muscle. It just helps the muscle to know how much to contract. And sort of the same mechanism you have. It's not exactly the same, but the same thing would happen in the tendon. Okay. Let's talk about some other motor pathways, because they are extrapyramidal. We mentioned them before, but as I told you, these tend to help with the homeostasis of our posture and movement. One such example is the reticular spinal tract. It helps regulate locomotion and posture. And these fibers don't tend to cross. They stay on the same side, the same ipsilateral side, not contralateral as we've seen before.